she can't be here. Unfortunately, I booked this session feeling that it was an important one for us to go ahead with as soon as possible, sooner rather than later, because of the deaths that we've been dealing with, the deaths that are happening in our communities, or have happened in our communities, whether from COVID or not, and the different ways that people have had to cope with smaller funerals, people not coming and visiting them, doing things electronically. So I booked this while Bishop Jim was away in the hope that she would be able to join us, but she did have a previous commitment in the end. This session is for our clergy, it's for our readers, and I'm delighted to say that many of our guests today are pastoral visitors in the diocese, as well, because of course they're not necessarily doing the bereavement visits, having contact with families who are bereaved very often, follow-up contact, if they've been visiting those who died over long periods of time. And of course the people that they visit or virtually visit at the moment, maybe they have bereavements in their families that they're struggling to deal with as well, especially if they've been shielding. So welcome to you all. The Reverend Paul Fitzpatrick is a friend of the diocese anyway, and worked in the diocese for many years. Came with us to Santiago, so many of you will have, many of the clergy will have met him in Santiago and had that experience all together with him. So thank you, Paul, for doing this for us. I wrote to Paul knowing that he was very much an expert in this area. And his response to me was how fortuitous, because he was already doing similar sessions for the university and for Cardiff Council. So Paul, we're very privileged to be able to draw on your wisdom today and be able to ask you questions. I think if we all mute when Paul begins to speak and save questions to the end, that will probably be the easiest way of doing things. We're going to move now to opening in prayer. As you know, our CMD days, one of the features that Bishop June has been keen to emphasize is that we all pray together. So I've asked Edward Owen to lead us in prayer, and then we'll move straight on to you, Paul. All right, I won't introduce you again. Lovely. Thank you, Edward.
So we're just going to have a poem for reflection and then a brief prayer. And this is entitled Day of Resurrection, and it's written by Rachel Mann. Beyond window as all should be, behold a church rises. Above garden and fence, behold a theatre of brick and sacrifice. Work of pulley and hand, love of centuries made tall. But I must not cling, I and you're enough, and I can hear bird whistle and whoop, mating call as alleluia. I can hear song above technology, headphones and Zoom. But if I must leave church locked, I shall be study piles of books, words and words and word. He is risen supposedly, he is. Can I believe without sight of candle, feast or flame? I shall find table where I can, gather fragments of bread, a splash of wine, all the sureties that he left behind, and the fateful words. This is my body and this is my blood. I see no witnesses, none seen. Though grant me sparrow and blackbird, magpie and wren, a single car, a hush as it passes the front door. Grant me that men and women somewhere, who still run away in wonder, are in awe. And so we pray. Into your hands, Lord, we humbly entrust our brothers and sisters. In this life you embrace them with your tender love. Deliver them now into your everlasting joy of eternal rest. As the old order has passed away, welcome them into paradise, where there will be no sorrow, weeping, or pain, but fullness of peace and joy, with your Son and the Holy Spirit, forever and ever. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Welcome, everyone. That was particularly beautiful, and that's a heartfelt thank you. Most of you all know that I'm a psychologist, I'm a chartered psychologist. The reason I'm saying that is because what we'll be talking about today will all be evidence-based. So I'm not going to be addressing things which do not have either clinical or strong academic basis for, proven basis for engagement. There is one thing which irritates me more than anything else when people are lecturing, and it's when they read their own PowerPoints. So I'm not going to do that. What we do is we go through is I'll give you a little bit of time to read the PowerPoints and then our discussion. Sometimes two of them will be linked, so I'll go through to give you time to read them, and then I'll work back on them with you if that's okay. The package that you're getting is not set at a low level. It's a postgraduate package, but we've had nobody that hasn't been able to engage with it. We've even trained people at the cleaning staff in our university who have most engagement with students asked to do it, particularly for our internationals who are still on campus. So it's a very readily, very easily understood package, but it is set at a very high level. All the research is less than 5 years old. I'm a bit challenging, but save questions to the end, and I'm really happy to engage at that level. Okay, and of course I will treat you as professionals, because in terms of grief and loss, that's exactly what you are. You're not just theological specialists, you are paleontologists. You are working with grief pretty much every day of your working life. I'm glad it changed. Okay, we're going to start with significant terms. I'll give you just a few minutes to read it through. Okay, so the key thing to take away from these early slides is the fact that bereavement doesn't mean death, or more accurately, it doesn't just mean death. When we talk about bereavement or grief or loss, and they're interchangeable in the way that we frequently engage with them, what we're actually talking about is significant loss. And that can include things like loss of identity, loss of family, loss of structure, loss of power and dog. And in my case, that would be catastrophic. And one of the key things that we're going to be looking at today is the fact that losses are not singular very often. So when you're dealing with people who have had losses, you are frequently not dealing with people who've had one loss or two losses, but frequently they've had 3 or 4 losses and the compound. And it's very easy just to deal with the biggest one in the pack, which is usually a death, but not always the case. And forget the fact that there is a bigger picture here, a bigger section of loss, which people are going through, or grief or bereavement, or mourning. So bear in mind the complexity of the issues of loss, and we're going to break that down as we go through this, so that makes a lot more sense. I want to go through the history, the clinical history of grief as we understand it. And most of that starts with Freud. So I'm going to give you a couple of slides on Freud just to read through, and then I'm going to slip back and talk about him. Okay, I'll do part two, which in a minute. What Freud's significantly saying is that when we invest energy, emotional energy, into an object or person, and note that even in 1918, Freud had identified that it wasn't just death. So when we invest energy into a person or an object, and that person or object is removed from us, that we lose that person or object, then what we do is we reabsorb the energy. We re-engage with the energy, and that's the process, as far as he was concerned, of grief. Now, Freud's model is an illness model. So when we lose these things, something from us has gone, and we grieve, we are damaged, we are hurt. And when we reabsorb the energy, we're fine. And this is where we get the term like moving on and gaining completion from. Very, very relevant in American literature and American films and American pop psychology today. You know, I want to get closure, I want to move on, not to leave it behind. The problem is it doesn't work like that. And the clinical evidence for this, with much of Freud's groundbreaking work, is not accurate. It didn't happen and it doesn't happen. There is no clinical evidence for this. Nonetheless, psychoanalysts are still using this today, particularly in America, and you will come across this idea. I'm sure we've all used those terms, but the fact is that it's not clinically proven. It doesn't actually happen. It's too simplistic. That model was held all the way up until 1967 to 1969. And then Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who I'm sure many of you know about, came up with her 5 stages of grief. Now, I'll let you just read through that before I interject again. And over the lockdown, like many of you, I've been watching a heck of a lot of television. And I think I saw 15 different references to this model as being currently accurate from American TV shows. It's very easy to remember. You go clunk, 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 go through the 5, and then you're well again. Obvious Freudian, in that it's absorbing the energy. You are ill, you go through these stages, you're well again. So you've taken back the energy, you've got control, you're moving on. There are significant issues with it. I mean, really significant issues with it. And the first is that it's not a bereavement model, even though that's how it's used, deployed, and sold. She watched people dying. She did not watch people grieving. She didn't look at the people who were by the bedside. She was engaging with people who were dying. So it's a dying model. It's not a commission for it. It was very unethical. It clearly and very rapidly, after she published her best-selling books on it, it became critiqued and criticized quite widely. And what Kubler-Ross did up until her death in 1996 was that she changed the model a little bit. So she said, instead of going through one rotation of grief, what happens is that we go through lots of rotation, and we go through it again and again and again and again, and eventually it's so insignificant that it doesn't matter. Again, it's an obvious Freudian model in that she's saying, we deal with grief, deal with the grief, deal with the grief, and then we are well again. We recovered from our illness of grief. Everything's fine, we can move on. If we don't do that though, we remain ill. And so there's a consequence in her model told. And I use this when I lecture as well. The first is, because you come across it, you need to know about it. So that you need to know its faults and its positives. And it does have some positives. One of the positives is that being a death model, you see it in places where you would not expect to see it. So what she saw does happen, but it doesn't happen in grief. For those of you who are old enough, like me, to remember the miners' strike, one of the things we saw very clearly in the villages after Chicago had lost that conflict, if I can use that, whole mining villages were going through this. You could actually see the stages rolling by. You get that again when people lose their jobs, particularly when there are massive redundancies, something we are going to be seeing. The model then displays as a communal model, and you do see people engaging with it. But it is a dying and a specific loss model, and it is very, very simplistic. When you're dealing with people, particularly in complex loss, and that's what we're discussing when we're talking about COVID, then you're not likely, frankly, to be seeing this. I'm just going to wait until that message is gone because it's blocking my ability to move on. There we go. Now, Colin Murray Parks, well, no, a psychiatrist and absolutely brilliant researcher. He was working with, familiar with that, about the consequences of loss of parental attachment in the first 5 years, which are enormous. They are really, really significant and very, very important and proven. But Colin was thinking more about how attachment might work with adults, and he wasn't happy with Kubler-Ross or the other proponents that supported the loss of energy model that Freud put. And so he did some really, really long-term and significant research. He worked with widows in East London for 9 years. Absolutely brilliant piece of research. And he came up with a model which is in which he called psychosocial. And just continue reading, please. Okay, this is really, so psychosocial transition explained. If you think of psycho as being me or you, the person, social is our world, our community, the people that we engage with and the ways that we engage with them. So psychosocial. Now the transitions are bridges or attachments into that world. Does that make sense at that stage? Good. Okay, so psycho me, social the world. Transitions are the sort of bridges, the attachments that link me into our community. Now that's essential because unless we are social and very few of us around, we have to be in community. We have to be part of our society. You can't be, which is why the SES train in isolation, because that's the most frequently observed torture. It's why we don't use it in prisons anymore. So complete isolation is not something that we do anymore because it destroys the person. So psychosocial transitions, these bridges that go out. Now they're individual. So no two people would have the same set of attachments of bridges into the community. So mine would have my family, my wife, my dog, ornithology. I am a massive bird watcher and a geek. Research. Wildness, mountain climbing. These are all things which link me into my community. Now, really importantly, they are things that give me my identity as well. So these things are part of who I am. And not only are they a part of who I am going out, they give me my identity within the community coming back. Now, what Parks discovered was that when you lose one of these significant ones, because we've all obviously got thousands of them, but when you lose a significant one, say a partner or a loved person, then what happens is that that's broken. So your link to the community and your link to yourself and your link to identity is broken, and we become unstable. It's almost like we're on a trampoline and all these attachments hold us stable. And when we lose a significant one, we wobble, we become unstable. And he said, this is grief. And we need then not to recover the energy, as Freud said, but frequently what we do is we re-establish a different bridge, a new type of bridge. And this is really important because we're going to come on to this later. And it is a significant difference to what Freud was saying. And one of the things he says is if you don't make that bridge, if that bridge doesn't re-establish in a different way, in a new way, and you just get stuck in that unstable, then the first stage is psychotherapeutic intervention, and then longer term could well be psychiatric intervention. So Parks really moved us forward hugely, but only for about 10 years. In 1996, the world of phalantology, the understanding of grief, changed completely and forever. It was a huge, huge difference. I'm just going to let you read this. Take your time with it because this is really important. Just read through this one too, please. Let me, thoughts memory in the brain, particularly at the back of the brain, record at different speeds. So the memories that we record overlap slightly. There is a slight then dysfunction in the way that our brains record memory. This is important. It's important because it means that our brains operate not as a recording machine where you press buttons and you get an accurate objective recording, but as a subjective narrative. What happens is that it's like a Wikipedia page. Every time we go into it, we are rewriting what we put in there. That's why courts don't use personal memory very much at all now, because it's totally unreliable. And convictions based on that have frequently been overturned. When we are in grief, the process is exacerbated, and I will explain why. So try and think of memory not so much as a chapter where, if you're losing Jane Austen, Mr. Darcy comes and he's not very nice, and Elizabeth gets very upset with him, and then the vicar turns up and he's a real gimp. And then eventually they make it up, they fall in love. You've got all these chapters falling in there. If you're talking about life chapters, you might say somebody died in the middle and then we got over it and then we moved on. But memory isn't like that, not when we're dealing with real people. It's almost like we have, one of my favourite euphemisms for this is a huge rug. I love tartan, I think it's wonderful material. But if our memory is like a rug going back with all different shapes and colours and fabrics within it, which is our history, it's massively important we understand it's not fixed. So when I look back at my most significant death experience, which is the loss of my father at an early age, the colour of the thread that represents my dad would maybe be bright red, vibrant and living and fun and happy. And through the years though, when I learned more about him, I learned that Dad wasn't always a good guy. And that other people didn't think the world of him. It sort of turned into a bluish colour. Now that's a very, stark interpretation. Things are much subtler than that. But every time we engage in our memory, we look back at our memory rug or picture or whatever, it changes slightly. And the reason that it changes is because we change. Now what's critical here is that this is a narrative. It's not a story. A story has a beginning, middle, and end. Narrative doesn't. It's tidal, it's fluid, it's dynamic. And so is our memory. When we go through grief and bereavement and loss, significantly, that pattern, that memory changes, and it changes quite critically, but it's not permanent. The next time we engage with it, it changes more subtly. The next time we engage with it, it's changed again. And this is why psychotherapeutic intervention, counseling work. It's because you are engaging with your memory, with your very fluid narrative, personal narrative. And because, as Park said, that narrative is your identity. It's who you are. And what we know about grief, and we know 100%, is that it impacts your identity. Grief changes you. That change is not permanent, but it is dynamic and it is fluid and it is ongoing. It's not fixed. And this is why stage models don't work. You sit there waiting for people to go through this stage and then into this stage and then into this stage and then they're recovered. That doesn't happen. Even though it is one of the most common sets of models in psychotherapy still used today, it doesn't work. And it's because we're individual and because our histories and our dynamics and our personalities and our values are all individualistic. And so our memory process, particularly in grief, becomes fluid and tidal. It moves backwards and forwards. And the colours in our memory, our understanding, our construction, us, changes. Is everyone okay with that? Has that, can I see some thumbs? If anybody's got problems with that, bring it up as a question at the end. But does everyone understand the basic premise? Continuing bonds means you do not lose the person that you've lost. They continue as part of your life moving forward. Fantastic, lots of thumbs, thank you. Can I just use two brief stories to emphasise this? When I was Vicar of Whipton, Real Dean of Exeter, believe it or not, the city of Exeter is called Christianity, so I was Real Dean of Christianity. We had a school where we had, some of you may actually remember it, it's Whipton Barton School, and a 4-year-old had been murdered there. And the class, I was a governor at that school, and the head teacher said 3 months after the murder, the class has not moved on. We've had the ed psychs in, we've had the advisors in, nothing has happened. Can you come and talk to them? Can you do anything to move this class on, because they are stuck? And I'm getting really quite worried about it. And I thought about it, and I spoke to some colleagues in child bereavement in London. And what we did was we took in a book, and it was Charlotte's Web. And I don't mean the film, the book. And what we did was we read a chapter of Charlotte's Web, last thing we did at the end of class, and the children were engaged with it. We didn't say, is everyone happy, does everyone feel, if somebody was upset, obviously we go to them, but it never happened. They took the story and they went out, and gradually, as we read Charlotte's Web, every chapter, by the way, is a different form of loss in that book. Gradually, the children became more animate, they became more engaged, they became more positive. Interestingly, so did the teaching assistants, who were also grieving. And by the time we finished the book, and the children were fine. It was a massive, it was not teaching the children how to grieve, but giving them permission to grieve. And if you want to see that in an adult form, if you want to see this in a novel, if anybody's read The Beekeeper of Aleppo, it's superb. Released last year, we've used it clinically. And it's an absolutely wonderful book about refugees coming from Aleppo. Obviously, one of them's a beekeeper, and how they grieve for the life that they've lost, and also for the things that happen to them when they're escaping. It's absolutely superb. I think the second key point that I want to come at, people relate to and grow with narration naturally. Grief is a natural, normal process. It is a trip to hell sometimes, It really is. But it is natural and normal. For most people, you are not sick when you're grieving. Most people. When it becomes complicated, and we'll talk about that later, you need intervention. But for most people, grief is a really, really dark and painful time. But because you process through it, and because it's a natural process and it's tidal, most people get through it. How we help them get through it is going to be important, particularly given the virus that we're fighting. Sorry, that's gone on 2. It should have just gone on 1. There you go. Culture and grief and loss. I'll just read through it. My university, and we're not alone in this, has 92 religions from 125 countries. We're just one of the universities in Cardiff, and the community that we serve has that same dynamic. Faith is incredibly important in our cultural and our narrative history, in our identity. I mean, really, really, really important. I've got nearly 35 different forms of Christianity, and some forms of Christianity don't believe that other forms of Christianity are Christian. It's a really wide and open dynamic, and that's before we start getting into secular understandings of instructions. And those of you who've worked in the health service will know this all too well. The point is that faith and the need to reach to God or for God is fundamental. 90% of the world, this is BBC research, 90% of the world own a deity, 90%. The BBC expect that to rise in the next 5 years to 96%. As a consequence, the only department in the BBC which is increasing is religion and faith. Every other department has been slashed and will continue to be slashed, but that one's growing because you can't understand the world unless you understand how people relate to faith. And that faith can be as small as a mustard seed, it can be as big as a tree. We all know that. That's our faith in context of loss, no matter what that faith is, and we all experience that in different ways when we're working with people. It's fundamental. It is huge. And I haven't put this in for your benefit, by the way. When I use this with the Home Office, when I've used it with the Welsh Government, I have made absolutely certain that faith is in there so that they understand that cultural engagement. My deputy now is working on the Disasters Committee in the Welsh Government for that very reason. Faith is fundamental to who we are, and therefore it's fundamental to understanding grief and loss. When I tap on, these are taking forever to tap on, so I'm sorry for that. There we go. The need to belong or to have a stable, involving identity is a core essential to mental health and well-being. That's a fact. It's compromised when individual beliefs and cultural norms are challenged, ignored, or disrespected by a lack of understanding. Grief and loss magnifies this process, really does, and can rapidly promote individual instability and group marginalisation. Who we are matter, and it matters most when we have lost something which is absolutely core, when we lose something of ourselves, our identity, our humanity. And that happens in grief. Something is torn out of us, and it takes us a while to adapt to it, to change, and to carry it with us healthily. That second bullet point, though, is absolutely critical. I have seen the most harm that I have seen to the grieving process is where the form of grieving has been disrespected. Most commonly, it's been through people who hold very deep and secular beliefs and feel that attacking God is the right in any environment. The second one, sadly, has been Christian ministers, and particularly those who are not well trained, not necessarily from the Anglican Communion, or who hold really, really firm and fundamental beliefs and principles. And their construction is so solid, their belief system is so solid that they impose that on other people. And you can't do that. If you do that, you're going to hurt them, you're going to destroy them, and you're going to send them away. Engaging with people is massively important. I'm going to address that in the next slide. Okay, how do we do it? How do we deal with a system of grief that we know is going to take 2 to 3 to 5 years in the individual? So you are not, that the amount of loss, the productivity of loss is so huge that this is, and so complex and compacted, that this is not going to be a simple grieving process. And sadly, it's not going to be the therapist or 6 sessions with counselling longer term that's going to have to pick this up. It is nearly always longer term clergy who deal with this and pick it up, and our wonderful pastoral teams more and more. The first thing is, don't panic. I'll just read through this. Okay, now with that last sentence, I am a massive fan of counselling, particularly fully qualified counselling. I really am, and I strongly support it. Counselling addresses, though, a deep-seated need. It goes from, it takes you to A to C via B, and B is often the place that you don't want to go. Counselling really does work. However, for most bereavement experiences, you don't need it. You really don't. It is, you can't take somebody out of the pain of loss in counselling, but you can in other ways. Counselling is when the grief has become so difficult, so compacted, that, if you want to use Kübler-Ross's model, the will has stuck and doesn't move on. A classic example of that is when parents lose a child and every night they sit outside the room that hasn't changed for the last 20 years. You know, I've seen that. That's a real, it's not a metaphor. That's when clinical intervention is absolutely essential. You can't deal with that, but we will address that moving on. Fixing the grief is one of the things, and counsellors sit miles apart, so that doesn't happen deliberately. But fixing the grief is one of the things which we significantly get wrong. I'm working with somebody last night who's allowed me to talk about this within the confines of confidentiality. And that's the problem. She's been trying to tell her husband that she knows how he feels, and she doesn't. She doesn't. She brings up her children. She manages the house. She is a brilliant and professional social worker. She can't fix this. You can't fix people to buck up or move on, or that you know what they're going through, because you don't. Grief takes time. It takes friendship. It takes engagement. It takes you listening. And sometimes you have to sit there and be with them in the pain. And again, most of you will know this, probably all of you. But it's good to reaffirm it, because it's essential. If you're sitting with people while they fall apart and come back together again, continuing bonds, and learn to adapt to living with their loss and carrying it with them, and carrying with that loss the love that goes with it, that change, that movement. If you can do that, you are doing more than you are doing the most important bereavement work that is possible to do. And in many cases, you are saving a life. Now, you may not be physically saving a life, or you may, but you are saving a person's sanity, their well-being, their personality, you are honouring who they are, and you're keeping that alive in them. You are allowing them to grow through the pain to a place which is more settled, and it will never be happy, but a place where they can live with it, where they've grown through it. The key point, though, is you cannot use targets or derivatives or lines. People grieve individually. No two people grieve the same. It's a very individual and a very broken, and sometimes often a very positive process. The third bullet point will be raising some hackles, I know. But when grief work, bereavement work, supporting people is not a confessional, okay? If somebody is a danger to themselves or other people, and we are working with them, we are legally required to get help for that person. And that can be done very intelligently, it can be done very sensitively. In the 13 years that I have been doing work at this level, at no time have I ever had to press the button when it's caused a problem. So the first thing I say when people come into work with me is, I will give you confidentiality, it's no problem, but if you are a risk to yourself and other people, then I may need to take that further. But I won't do that until I talked with you first. That's the key gutsy bit, where you say to them, I'm not going to do anything until I've talked to you. But then when you've got somebody who has real problems, who have serious mental health issues, who may be a danger to themselves or other people, you can talk to them and say, look, I need to say this further. We agreed this at the start, and this is where I am. Again, in 13 years, I have never had a serious issue along those lines. And we need to be very, very careful, because when you have deep grief, as we discovered, particularly with continuing bonds work and with what Colin Murray Park talked about with the attachments, and they sit together, by the way. When 2 or 3 or 4 attachments have broken and you are in longer term grief, and very clearly your gut is telling you, evolutionary psychology, by the way, that something is wrong, you need to trust that. I'm not going to give you a list of things to look out for because you're expert already, you're professionals. When your gut is telling you that there's something wrong, and you need to own that. Now, if they have a mental health history, the person you go to obviously could be the community mental health, it can be the GP, it can be a colleague, because we shouldn't be now working alone with these things. We should always be working in teams within parishes and teams cross parish as well. I certainly don't work alone, and I never have done. This is probably the most difficult thing to talk about, but we're already seeing with COVID an enhanced breakdown in mental health and in community cohesion. And when you lose community cohesion, remember we were talking about the attachments, bonds, psychosocial transmission. When you lose that, people lose their support. They lose their structures. And so we are going to see in the next 2 or 3 years, and it's already beginning, the evidence is there, we're going to see a bigger fracture in community than we've seen before. And it's really, really important that we're ready to respond to that. It is equally important that we understand as clergy that we can't do that alone. You cannot take this alone when it becomes overwhelming. You need to be talking to other people, to teams, obviously to our line management, but within the context of a team within a parish. So pastoral workers should be working as a team, never alone. Common sense, I know, but it needs to be said again. You can't give confidentiality, because if you give absolute confidentiality, how do you press the button when they're suicidal, or when, and this has happened to me on a number of occasions, they become psychotic because the grief has been so long and so buried and so deep that the damage, the neurological damage to them has been extraordinary. And unresolved grief, untreated grief, unsupported grief can lead very frequently to very severe depression, self-harm, and I say, and psychotic illness. We need to be very careful the longer term compromise that we make. 90%, and that's really a good figure, 90% of people going through grief will come out the other end having been supported, having had listening support, structured support, just having somebody there who listens and understands the pain but not the journey, but is there to journey with them. But friends on a journey leave. And so we need to be able to, at some stage, walk away when the grief is managed and moved on. But very frequently, the need to belong, the need to have an identity, and I'm going to go back a couple of slides. There. When we have catastrophic loss, our need for identity intensifies because part of us, as we discussed, has been destroyed. And the need to belong becomes absolutely central. And that belonging is particularly relevant in terms of faith. You know, belonging, holding, being held by God, by deity, by our Father, Mother if you prefer, but by God is essential. And by God's church, obviously, de facto, it's one, it is the route towards God. The major route is through clergy. The need to belong is fundamental. If that's been damaged, the need for identity has not been held or helped with, and there is the loss of belonging, the loss of destruction has not been repaired, has not been allowed to become continued bond in a healthy way. Absolutely dire. Just wait for this to catch up. Analysing doesn't work. We all do it. It's part of our, we look at it, oh, I've seen this before, I know where you're going. It honestly doesn't work. Relationships do. When you know somebody, when you've worked with them, when they're part of the congregation or understand, in a way that other people simply don't, you know your parishes, you know where you're working, you know your communities, you know your people. Relationships which are built up really matter. Having a cup of coffee with somebody really matters. Sitting in opposite chairs to them and asking them how they feel doesn't. Relationships work, and it's something that we, the clergy, do really well. I'm going to close at that. Apologies. I'm going to be open to questions. If you want to come through and chat, if you don't want to talk, that's fine, but open your mics and chat if you want to as well.
That's one of the ways that people can indicate that they've got a question is to use one of the reactions, put the hand up in a reaction.
I'm sorry, my hearing aids didn't pick that up.
Right. I'm just saying that you can wave the hand, Paul.
Jesse Smith.
Okay.
Jesse Smith.
Yep.
Go ahead, Jesse.
Yeah, it's just a really, I don't know how to quite phrase it, but it's about one of the last points you made, which I totally understand. That sort of awful question, like how do you feel? And I know that you know, we were taught, like, you know, like over 20 years ago, you know, that's a stupid question to ask. You know, how do you think I'm feeling? 3 guesses. But is there any way in which there can be a more nuanced, helpful way of expressing that? You know, like when you meet someone, is it at all appropriate in any more nuanced, sophisticated form to just say, you know, how are you doing today, or just as
You've just nailed it.
You know?
That's perfect. That's relationships. It's not the step back and how did that make you feel, but the God, that must have been absolutely awful. Oh, I really feel for you. I'm being heartfelt and honest and truthful about it. I'm just saying, I'm so sorry that happened. How are you doing? Do you need to talk? Do you want a cup of coffee? Do you want to meet up at any time? I mean, you just nailed it. That's so beautifully put. Thank you. Do it. That's fine, as long as it's honest and it's truthful. And I'm sure it will be. Then you're building on a relationship that already existed. Sympathy and empathy really matters. Hugely important. what you don't need is a congregation full of counsellors. There are people that are not afraid to be hugged occasionally, when it's permissible to do that.
Yeah,
I'm sorry, did someone else come in?
I always imagine someone is feeling pretty rubbish when they're bereaved. Occasionally I meet people, I don't know who are, the death is, it's not they don't care, it's just that the reaction is odd, it's completely numb, or it's like, I'm feeling fine actually, I don't know. But but the honesty though, several years ago I had a pretty rubbish diagnosis of cancer, and the most helpful thing anyone said was not any of my Christian friends, but it was an atheist friend. When he heard the news, he goes, "Oh, Jesse, that's crap." And that was like so fantastic. That was the best thing anyone said to me. No, that's crap. Anyway, thank you.
No, thank you for that. That really matters. What you just said really matters. When my dad died, remember I said I had this idealistic relationship with my dad, and he was my hero, and he was absolutely wonderful, and he was a neighbour officer. I went in and I couldn't really understand why my mum never grieved. It felt like she had been released when he died. She flowered, she became herself, she never cried, she never got upset, she never moved on. And it wasn't until I was in my 40s that she told me that he was a serial adulterer, that he had had relationships left, right and centre, and every time he did it, a bit of a dark.
I can't hear.
No.
Paul, I'm not sure. I think we're struggling to hear you. Has something happened to your audio, your end? We're not hearing anything at all now, I don't think. You're not muted.
Okay. Is that any better?
No.
You're still very quiet. For some reason it's decreased in.
Yeah, I'm in the back end of a wood surrounded by 5 miles of farms, so we get intermittent service here at best.
Right. Your volume seems to have been turned down or something.
Catch my last reply?
Yeah, about the woods.
Yeah. No, about my mum. No, about my mum.
Yeah.
Yes.
Very quiet though.
Okay. Maybe any more questions could come through chat?
Yeah. Caroline, do you want to ask a question?
It wasn't really a question. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Very clearly.
Yeah.
It wasn't really a question. It was a comment, because I think one of the most really important things that there's loads of important things in those slides and in what you've been saying, but was the bit that said, sit with it, don't try and fix it.
Yeah.
Because that can be hard to do, can't it? Because we're human, and other people's extreme emotions have an impact on us. But I think it's so important, because I was speaking to someone who was in a psychiatric appointment, and they were devastated by the fact that it was a psychiatric nurse couldn't cope with their pain and left the room. And that was a huge help that they shared that with me. It was very unfortunate for them. It's been resolved now, but it must make people feel ashamed if we try and fix it and give answers, because most of the time people, they know the answers or they don't want answers, but to try and not show, I don't mean hide our feelings. If we're affected by somebody's grief and that shows, I think that's fine, but not to try and fix it and to try to stay with it. I thought that was really important.
Thank you,
I think
Caroline.
that's huge. My first training incumbent said that when you're working with people in pain, it's like a kettle. And what we do is we take the lid off the kettle to allow the steam out. He said you've got to be very, very careful you don't get burnt. It's learning to sit with it and not to try and fix it, not to try and make the water not boil, is absolutely essential. And it's key, and it's the most important thing in bereavement and grief care. That by far, by country mile, the most important thing is to sit with people, to hear them, to talk to them, not just expect them to talk to you, to be in an approach pain and let it wash over you and allow them to talk about it, to be hurt.
Yeah, thank you.
I don't know what the thinking still is, but I know at the beginning of lockdown, people were talking about, once we could meet again, having memorial services. I know that when I used to hold a memorial service every 6 months for our hospice when I was a hospital chaplain, and we would always hold it in a venue where people were corked with a cup of tea before they could leave. And I used to say that the words that I said or we sang were far less important than the sharing people did with one another, with everybody there with a common purpose. Do you think that sort of thing might help community cohesion as we are experiencing community breakdown, as you described it, Paul?
Absolutely, I think that's a very, very relevant and a massively important point. It isn't always the words, it's how we relate, it's how we communicate. It's a cup of tea, for goodness sake. It really works, which is why we've used it for the last 100 years. You know, it is a way of opening up and allowing the community to grieve and to work through things together. We're not going to be through this for at least 2 years. And so the amount of damage that our communities are going to suffer is going to be compounded, particularly those who are isolated or alienated. And anything we can do to increase it, because we are about relationships. We are church. I mean, that's what we are. It's what we do. Anything we can do that would enhance that, and memorial services are absolutely brilliant. It is a fantastic, and a memorial garden is not the way to go ahead, because we're going to have more memorials than we can ever visit or want to. But a memorial service, a way of marking the fact that we have lost things and people that we love, really, really matters. I'm not going to embarrass him by naming him, but one of the best services that I attended, funeral service, was when one of my colleagues committed suicide, and her service was here in Cardiff. And it wasn't the tribute or the blessing of the coffee. What he just did, a very simple reading from Lamentation, and it broke hearts in the church. We had people in that church from all the sort of different religious and many secular communities. Everybody bonded on that, everyone. When I went back to the university, everybody was talking about it. It wasn't the way it was delivered, it was delivered beautifully, it was the choice. And it's the one sentence in that whole service which brought us all together. It was wonderfully done. And simple things really matter. They really make an impact. And you know, he communicated God on that day, healing, love, forgiveness, and allowed us the pain to grieve. It was beautifully done. And thank you. You know who you are.
On the chat feed, Paul, I think Martin Evans has a question for you about fractured community.
About? Fractured
community.
Yeah, go ahead.
Ask your question.
Paul, I was thinking about your comment about the fractured community over the next 2 to 3 years, and I was wondering whether or not there's any guidance, any suggestions as we start to think about the number of people that are going to lose jobs as a result of COVID, the impact on mental health, the stresses of people returning to schools and even back to our churches. So I was wondering if there was any practical guidance you had for us.
Yeah, I think the most important thing is, well, we've already touched on it, but I'm really glad you asked that question. Thank you. Because the fractures are going to be on so many different levels, and that's so many different intensities within those levels. No church can answer all of them. So do what you can, not what you can't. Reaching out into the community is really important, but the key thing is to do it as a group, to do it as a team, to make sure that people are talking to each other and not just going off and doing their own things. Clerics are very good at leading. We're trained to do it. We're trained not to be downward with gentleness and with compassion and with leadership. I mean, genuine leadership. We're really good at holding churches together. We need to do that on a wider spectrum, but you need to choose where you do it. Each community is going to be different, and each parish will be addressing its situation very differently. So if you're in central Cardiff, you know, there's one parish there, St Martin's, probably 50% of that parish is not Christian. It will have a different faith tradition, maybe Muslim. There's an awful lot of Buddhists moving in now, and Hindus as well. If you were in Ely, the predominant faith in Ely would be Christianity. But the needs of those two parishes would be completely different, absolutely different. And an understanding of where the fractures are occurring within that community is central to how you respond to it. The key, absolute key thing is do what you can, not what you can't. Don't try and do everything, because you'll become diluted, you'll become overwhelmed, and it'll become too difficult. Choose where you engage. And one of the classic things for that, again, leadership, again, you all do this, you know how to do it. Plan for where the hole is, plan for what you can do, and plan for where you can engage. You know, and obviously, again, common sense, we all do it. Pray like mad, because, you know, prayer works. It really helps the Holy Spirit guide us to where we need to be. And I sound like a bishop saying that, so please forgive me. It's not my role or place. But when I get in trouble, when I'm looking at, when I've been working with the homeless and I'm looking at really dangerous people that I'm working with, I look for the key to open the door. I look for where I can make a difference and where I can engage. Where that person needs me to be, and it's exactly the same in communities. But I am always guided, like you, in prayer, because it works, and it does take you down the right path. But boy, if you've got to protect yourself, you really have got to look after yourself and your teams. You know, it's so easy to be overwhelmed, and then you're no good to yourself and you're no good to other people either. It was a hard lesson for me to learn, both as a psychologist and as a cleric, that I need to pull back. I can't be there for everyone. I can't. I can only be there where I can. So choose where you engage and choose where your teams engage, and give yourself enough time to breathe and recover, because it's going to impact you. I think it's Caroline that said that, and she was absolutely right. You know, the next 2 or 3 years is going to be really tough on you guys in particular. I'm retired, so I'll be in a supporting role down here with the clerics down here. But you guys are really on the front line, and you're going to see it, both in terms of community and in terms of individuals. So you've got to look after yourselves, and you've got to protect yourselves, and you can't over-engage, and your teams can't over-engage either.
Thank you.
Sorry, I'm to use subjects.
I know Jesse's got a supplementary question. Has anybody else got some questions they want to ask? Just looking for hands. Jesse, do you want to ask your question?
I feel guilty because I've already asked a question.
That's all right.
So maybe, just Paul, just before you were cut off, you were saying something I found very interesting. You know, I don't know what the term might be, but ambiguous grief, where, you know, there's a huge expectation that someone is feeling great pain or sorrow, but they might be, I don't know, there's one person I know recently, and it's kind of like relief. But then there's all sorts of painful feelings about that, and grieving for what should have been but wasn't. I don't know. Could you just, you were just beginning to say something about that, and then we lost you.
I was talking about my mum. I couldn't understand why my mum didn't grieve my dad, whom I loved enormously. And the reason she didn't grieve him in the way that I did, she didn't grieve him at all, by the way, she flowered when he died, was because I didn't know, but she knew, he'd been having multiple adulterous relationships. And every time that he'd slept with a different woman, a part of her died. So when he died, she had an enormous release. And then in her second marriage, she found love and contentment. And I was angry with her forever over that. But once I realized that dad, you know, the colors changing on the weave, that dad wasn't perfect. And there was another side to him. and a side my mum knew and I didn't, it changed the way I viewed grief. And grief can be a relief. If you've been looking after someone you love forever and they've got out looking after them over year and year and year and year, my wife's mum is in this situation, then the bereavement is a release, because anticipatory grief has already kicked in. They've already grieved. They've already gone through the losing process, the loss process, not once, maybe 2 or 3 times. And when the actual event happens, then it is a relief. Thank God it's gone. Thank God it's happened. I can breathe. It's not about moving on and leaving behind. I can breathe. I can live. I can sleep at night. I can start to become me again. We don't walk in other people's shoes. You know, every grief is individual. We don't know their stories. We don't know what they're going through. And we don't know their history. We don't know how they react. And we don't know them at their deepest level. Only they do. And that's why we can never judge other people's grief ever. Not going into a contemporary mourning process does not mean that you don't love the person or the object that's been lost. It doesn't mean that. It really doesn't. Supporting them is even more important under those circumstances. Thank you. Good question.
Thank you.
I can see Rose has got her hand up there.
It could be a yes or no answer to this question, really. Just thinking about ambiguous grief. Do you think ambiguous grief can work on a communal level as well as a individual singular level? You know, for communities, for example, if you've got a community that's been waiting for a factory to close and then suddenly it does close, you know, things like that. Do you think, or indeed at a family level as well as you know, so does ambiguous grief apply at a communal as well as an individual level is my question, I suppose.
Fantastic question. Thank you. Yes, absolutely. Remember we talked about narratives having lots of different threads and not being singular. You've just tapped big time into that. You know, losing your job, losing a factory, losing a community, losing a family position, losing family structure, community structure, individual structure, all interplaying, all interweave. And if there's one thing that I'd want you to take away from today, it's that. Grief is not about somebody dying and then that individual moving on. It is massively complex and compounded, and it relates directly to communities. That was a brilliant question, and my answer is yes. Thank you.
Just scanning through to see if I can see anybody else with a hand up. Emma Street.
Hi, it's just a comment that I would like to say. And I really, really do appreciate the individual, the individuality that you've really struck here, because it's no size fits all, and it's encouraging everybody to respond to everybody on that individual basis. So thank you for that.
Thank you. And again, that's the second point that I really wanted to make today. Don't follow curves, don't follow profiles, don't follow patterns, don't predict. You know, everyone is individual, and everybody is unique. Thank God.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, is it Sarah Andrews?
It's Sue Andrews.
Sue, sorry.
The question I'd like to ask is, at the moment, with the way the situation is, how do we engage with people with their grief? I don't think we're allowed to meet even with them, are we?
No, that's a very good point. I think the first thing is acknowledging and finding new pathways in. This relates to a question we had a little bit earlier about how do you see the cracks in community, how do you address them? You're absolutely right. A memorial service, obviously, when you can do that, particularly if you do it outside, is is a good way of engaging with that. There are other ways. I find grapevines, newsletters going out that address this particularly. Fruits of the Parish is a good way of doing it. Going online is a good way of doing it. Radio is a good way of doing it. There are ways that you can adapt communication. But also you are parish clergy and pastoral and readers, pastoral assistants and readers. You are in the community. There's a group of you going out. And so relationship training in terms of bereavement, grief and loss is a great way to move forward, because people do interact, obviously. We're not all living in shells and in bunkers. And using your teams in that respect to work in that area is a great way. But also, I mean, one of the things Ely's pastoral team did was that very, very quickly, the mental health teams realised that the church had a pastoral team, and they used them. So that team became a part of the bereavement care for Ely. Now, again, that could be done. They were all properly trained, all properly supervised, and Jan, their parish priest, did a brilliant job of oversight, and she and herself got supported. And of course, that can be done online. It can be done by telephone. It can be done by talking over a fence. There are different ways. I haven't got a clear answer for you, Sue, because it depends on where you are. But there are ways to doing it, but we're going to have to do it differently, and we're going to have to find individual parish responses to community grief and to community damage. And that's a big challenge. It's a big challenge. And so I don't have a template.
No, I mean, I know our Benefice has put together a booklet which we give to everyone, but one of our ladies in the church, particularly that I attend when I'm not on duty because I'm a reader, she rang me to ask me if I'd come and pray for her. And because it's a very difficult situation, because it's not something you can easily do over we can do it on the phone, but it's not quite, it's not quite that type of interaction, because it's a thing that I would normally do. For me, bereavement has been a big part of my ministry. Yeah. Coming alongside people, I mean, I've done quite a lot of courses. I mean, listening, I mean, to me, you can't do more than listen and just let the person talk and talk about what's happened, how they are feeling. You don't ask them what they're feeling, you let them talk so that their feelings are coming out. And it's very difficult to try and help them in that stage of their grief at this particular time. It's just, I just feel that they're so stuck, and it's just so hard. You can sort of, where the need is, but somehow you can't quite meet that need. Yeah, that's why I asked the question. So I thought, I'm sure the situation hasn't changed yet. We're not allowed to actually visit.
No, a lot of the work I'm doing is on the phone at the minute, but also this way, Teams as well, a really good tool. Skype is still a good tool. There are ways you can go face to face with them. I think the thing I'd want to say to you most of all, though, is thank you. I honestly believe that readers are the future of the church in a minute. We desperately need more of you. You bring such a wealth of experience to pastoral work, as well as in preaching and teaching. Readers are fabulous, and I wish that the churches were full of them. So you have my massive support there. Everything you just said, though, is true. Everything. And what I did yesterday when I was working with the social worker who's allowed me to use her story today, she was on the phone for about an hour. I was speaking to her again on Friday. And I know her really, really well. It's ridiculous. Of that hour, maybe 40 minutes were of her talking and me listening. Once you get the floodgates open, all sorts of things happen. Yeah. When we get secular people that come into my, I've just retired about a month ago, but when they came into my office, the first hour was dominated by I don't want to talk about God, but the second visit, you couldn't shut them up about God. Whoa! And I think once you manage to open the door, and particularly for people who are hurting, then you have released the pressure, which is why you need to look after yourself, because it's tidal as it sweeps over you. But then you started to build a relationship. You started to do what we as Christians have been called to do. And it's wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for what you do.
Thank you.
I suppose one last thing I'll just add on. On that booklet that you sent out, I strongly suspect that there were telephone numbers on there. making sure they're responded to is really, really positive.
I'm just scanning for any other hands that might be up. Any other questions for Paul? Paul, thank you so much for your time and your experience and sharing that with us today. I'm sure that many of us will take away some of the things that you've said and reflect on them. I'm certainly going to go away and buy The Beekeeper of Aleppo and read. I think there was a huge amount for me about grief being relational, about it being about storytelling, and that whole area that's so difficult for us to engage with. How it feels so unnatural. It's like a bit like Sue was saying. It feels so unnatural not to be able to go and pray with someone, not to be able to visit them. But that whole challenge to us who are called to care for communities about how we do it in this context and during this time. Thank you so much for those reminders about it being relational. And
you're very welcome. Richard, would you please share my email address with everybody? And if anybody needs to follow up or wants to follow up, I'd be really, really happy to do that. Sometimes just having an ear, which is outside the diocese, when there's a difficult situation, is fine. My team still do it from the university. So I'm really, really happy. If you want to, I'd welcome that. That'd be fine.
Perhaps what I'll do is make put these slides as well as the recording on the website and attach your email address to these slides. How would that be?
Thank you.
Right. Paul, thank you so much. I know that you've received a thank you email in advance
I have.
to this, but we wish you well in retirement. You don't sound like you're very retired to me. Every blessing to you in your ongoing ministry.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for your contributions to today.
I'll end the meeting for all now, okay?
Thanks, David.
Bye, everyone.